Do you ever feel that existential dread of not being able to use all your gear at a whim's notice? And do you feel bad about tying all your gear down? Do you want to be able to move things without moving things? As Mark Twain once said, there's no sadder thing than a young pessimist than an old optimist. In today's video, we are going to free your gear and also free your mind. So grab a cup of coffee and endure with me this intro graphic. Hello, I have no mom, but I have a computer. And in today's video of We Have Venus Theory at Home, we are going to look at some bad gear to do some cool things. So let's go. So in today's video about patchbays, which is now a running theme of this channel, well at least for a couple of videos following this video, I want to talk a little bit about using outdoor gear with a patchbay, and more specifically doing some things which are a little bit maybe untraditional, but I think pretty useful. Patchbays are really often rack-oriented gear where you plug everything into the back, which works in a lot of instances. But with synthesizers and pedal boards and stuff like that, you might run into the situation where you want to patch something into the front of it without having to go all the way behind the rack. Now there are several ways of doing this. There's probably very professional ways and very janky ways. And I want to highlight a few of these methods, going from the cheap and janky way up to the probably pretty expensive way. Which I can't demonstrate because I don't own it. So let's start off with the basics. So this is my patch bay. I have labeled it. It's a little bit sloppy, but hopefully readable. D50, JDXA, System 1, JV880, JV1080. Then I have an empty slot, my pedal board, and this is my looper. And we'll go into how this actually works in a second. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, this is the JDXA running through the pedal board, through the looper, into the audio interface. So this is something you might want to do, and this goes for synths as well. You might want to patch into the front of your patch bay, and I want to show some ways to do this without changing the inherent hierarchy of the patch bay. So the inherent hierarchy of the patch bay is every output goes on the top, and every input goes on the bottom. That's basically the main concept behind patch bay. So let's quickly unpatch the mesh we have going on here. There we go. And let's start with the basics. So the first thing you can do, which is probably the cheapest way to obtain a front patching way while maintaining the hierarchy of the patch bay, is by creating a loop. So the way I did this is fairly simple. I basically took one of the bottom ports on the back and patched it into the top port next to it. So this is on the back, not on the front, but on the back. That's what's happening here. Now the core concept here is if you take a patch cable, you can now take an output and you can patch into the input of this loop, which is here. So signal goes out of the JDXA into this slot. Now we can patch anywhere else. So we can take a cable, and this is the cable of my pedal board, and plug it into here. So the signal is traveling from the JDXA into here. This is patched into here. So it's now an output. We can patch that to the pedal board. So let me quickly move you around. It goes there and into the tuner. And now you can take the output of your pedal board which happens to be this plug, and we can plug this into any input. So let's plug it into this input. Or we can plug it into this input. Doesn't really matter. So this is the jankiest and cheapest way of doing this, and this way you can maintain the top row output, bottom row input. The only downside, of course, is that you are using 2 rows to do something. So another way to do this that I forgot to mention in my original take was you can also, if you have a patch bay with through, do it a little bit jankier even. So what we have going on here is the JDXA going into the pedal board and be turning here. So how we set this up is you need to have a patch part set in through mode, and on the back you just create a simple loop. Definitely not a recommended way to use a patch bay, but it works. So now if we input the JDXA in the bottom, where it should be, it gets fed back up to this port, and this is still the red wire going to the tuner here. So that's the same red wire. And the output of the pedal board is just the wire going straight here. So this works as well. Just do a quick demonstration. Let me turn off the pedals. And now we can turn on the pedals. And this way you can actually keep it within one slot. But if your patch bay does not have a through mode, you have to stick to the 2-column approach, which I explained before. Kind of painful. If you don't have much space, well, I have plenty of space, so I can easily do this. But I wanted to find a solution that was a little bit prettier. And what I came to is this solution. There we go. Always fun with effects. So what I've done is I've created a panel in the bottom, and I will insert some photos of what it looks like on the inside. So this is basically an XLR thing with the empty slots, which you can buy, and these connectors are jacks to XLR. So there's a jack in front and an XLR on the back, and these XLRs are connected to the patch bay. So this port here, which says pedal board, is connected to this bottom output. And there's an input here. Input's at the bottom. That's connected to the input here. So we can plug our pedal board. Need to get a better connector for that, but now we can connect everything nice and down low. And if we want to connect the JDXA, we can just keep everything on top here. So we can take a patch cable from the JDXA out into the pedal board in, and we can go out of the pedal board into the interface. And this looks pretty clean, and you can do some more complicated stuff with this, and that's what I've done with the 2 slots right next to it. And as you can see, this is also a little bit more compact, because now you'll have just 1 row, so you can actually use more rows, which is neat. So in the slot over, what I've done is I've hooked in a looper. It's the dual stereo looper, which I can probably just about get in frame. That's that little baby there. So that's hooked into those 4 ports. It's a stereo looper, so you have the left input and the right input, and the left output and the right output, of course. So let's say we want to involve the looper. Well, we can use it like any other patch bay. We can just say we take the output of the looper into the interface. And the one annoying thing of this looper is the ground is on the input, so you need to take the input and connect it to something. Doesn't really matter what you connect it to, but you need to connect it in order to break that ground. And now we can actually just go down here. And we have a loop going. If we wanted to send this loop into the pedal board, we can also do that up here. We can say we take the output of the loop into the input of the pedal board, input at the bottom, and we take the output of the pedal board into the interface. And this is a pretty sleek way, I think, to solve this connecting patch bay or connecting things to the front of the patch bay issue. You can also do this with synthesizers. So for instance, I wanted to hook the JDXA into the front of the card, which might happen at some point. It's pretty easy to expand after all. I might actually do that, because the nice thing here is if I wanted to move the pedal boards, all I have to do is just take these jacks, take them out, and now I can move the entire pedal board without even having to think about it. So that's pretty neat, and I think that's a very nice feature. Now this solution is a little bit jank, and it isn't the cheapest possible solution. Obviously the cheapest possible solution is just using the patch bay you already have, like I showed in the first example. But it's a nice space saving, and it allows you to determine where you want to connect your things. So for instance at the bottom of the rack, so you can keep all the cables nice and low, and you don't have all these drooping cables over the rest of your gear, which is, I think, a nice plus. Now you might be thinking, well, I can also just buy another patch bay, which is a very sensible solution. And yes, you absolutely can. That's actually the third option. But it's also by far the most expensive option. Buying another patch bay and basically using it in through mode is absolutely viable. The obvious downside is patch bays aren't all that cheap. So this specific patch bay is like 170 euros, something like that. And that's how much you would have to spend for another patch bay. And you have to add all the cables, so that's going to get fairly expensive. This solution, although not the cheapest, it is a little bit less expensive. I think I spent about 50-60 bucks for this. Of course, the obvious downside is it has far less ports. It is expandable, and you can change ports as well, which is kind of nice, because I can just flip these around and I can use them as XLRs instead of jacks. So it's a nice little bonus and it looks fairly good, I think. Another downside is it is using gears in ways they aren't intended to be used, so it's not optimal and it will probably piss off a few audiophiles, but you can't win them all. That's basically the motto of this channel. You can't win them all, but it does work. You can do some pretty fun stuff with these things, because now I can actually choose to patch the looper before my pedal board, but I can also choose to patch it after my pedal board. I can have the looper under my desk and I can play into it from my keyboards and then output it through the pedal board, for instance, or I can capture a performance with pedal boards into the looper, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very nice flexible setup. And again, if you want to move stuff or you need stuff, if you need to make plays, it's as easy as pushing the button, removing the cable, and that's it. So yeah, that's my rather janky idea for patchbays, to make them a little bit more modular and easier to manage in some situations. I hope you found this information interesting. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and for now, have a great day. Now, you might be wondering, why not just use one of those slotted patch bay things, like for instance I've created here. You can just plug cables into the back and feed them out the front, and then just plug them into your instruments. And if you need to move your instruments, you can just remove the plugs from the instrument and just tie the cables up or something like that. Which is definitely a way to do it. I just think this approach is a little bit sleeker, a little bit easier to work with, because now you don't have to deal with all the excess cables, because you can quite easily disconnect everything, which is pretty neat. So if you need to move the patch bay, for instance, you're just that little bit less cabled up. You can quite easily just remove everything and get things out of the way, which I think is pretty neat in this solution. Otherwise you would disconnect the cables on the board side and you would still have cables lying everywhere, which is just a little less clean looking. And also it eliminates having all these cables like a waterfall from the front of your rack, which definitely doesn't make things easier to read. It's already a little bit cluttered here. So having that option to reduce the cable mass is always welcome, of course. And also because you can't easily get behind this rack, it's nice to have the mobility to be able to move the rack without having to dismantle it altogether. And at the same time you could get away with having a lot of slack on your cables, of course, but you need to store all the slack somewhere, which eventually ends up in a tangle of wires anyway. So I think this is a pretty neat solution. It's definitely not required for everyone, but yeah, just wanted to show it off.